Today we're going to be looking at the accountability framework with our superstar here, Matt Wood, who, if you want to introduce yourself, Matt, and your job title and what you do at Bud.
I think superstar covers that. Thank you,
Yeah,
yeah,
resident northerner.
the resident owner. Yeah, we're only allowed one at Bud, and I've got it. I'm Matt Wood. I'm the product owner. So I was recently the funding and compliance manager at Bud in the last year, but in the last few months I've joined the product team. So my job is to look after the new exciting developments that we've got in other skills and training, so our non-apprenticeship delivery. But I always keep an eye on all the apprenticeship world because that's where my history is, and I love it.
Yeah, that's where your sort of expertise is like looking at finding the little minutiae within the compliance details. And
I get the joy of reading all the documents and trying to figure out exactly what's going on, which,
you
like
love
many
it.
other people in the sector, it sometimes takes a while.
You love it, really. Well, if you want to share your screen, Matt, and just take us through that new accountability framework for 21 and 22. And also, if you could just give us a little idea of who this is applicable to, and also, maybe the people that within training providers that this would be most applicable to, or if it filters down to everybody within that training provider.
Yeah, of course. So you can see on here that it's obviously found on the Gov website. You can see it was published in August 21. So the history of this is back in January 21, the ESFA released the FE white paper where they set out their expectations to publish a new accountability framework. This sort of comes back on the ESFA trying to be a little bit tighter on their management controls of providers. So a part of that we've already seen in action is the refresh of the ROAPT, so the Register of Apprenticeship Training Providers. And this accountability framework follows that, starting in this new academic year. So it was published literally the second day of the academic year. So it's already in place now. But I think at this moment it's still a little bit of a transition year. So who it's aimed at really is, I think, it's aimed at training providers in general. Particularly senior managers and leaders are going to be interested in this because it dictates to them some of the things that the SFA are going to look to them to provide and some of the things that they should be measuring. And so in turn, that's going to sort of cascade down across all of the people in training providers, right down to tutors delivering on the ground. Your IQAs doing the sort of sampling work of tutors, but just everybody in general. But I think senior managers in particular, the ones who want to read this one, to see exactly what the SFA are thinking.
Does it feel like because they're kind of like trying to tighten up on how many people are on the ROAPT, does it feel like these sets of guidelines have got a little bit more harsher or more difficult to sort of meet those accountability framework measurements?
I think they're tighter in some respects, but actually I think some of the changes we've seen are quite good in that they're making progress in some common sense areas as well. The SFA sometimes has a reputation for maybe not being the most common sense applied organization, but actually they're really listening to providers now. So following the white paper back in January, they held a consultation period in the spring, and so they've actually listened to training providers and they've published the framework on the back of that. So yeah, it is getting tighter. I think the refresh of the ROAPT is an indication that they want to ever so slightly squeeze out some of the providers on there who are not delivering or who haven't been delivering for a long time and not upholding the standards that they expect. But they're not, they're also not looking to punish providers. Providers shouldn't be worried that this is going to be something that's going to come down on them, really, really hard. The SFA just want to have a little bit more visibility and a little bit more control, but also they want providers to take accountability, because that's what it's about. Providers managing their own data. And part of this is actually the SFA wanting to intervene a little earlier where things are going wrong. So not leaving things for a couple of years, coming into doing an audit or something and finding that everything's going wrong. Actually helping providers to put their hands up and say things are not going great and we need your help. Or if providers are not willing to do that, the SFA have the tools to do that themselves.
Always good to have structure.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, for somebody like me, that's great. But yeah, in terms of what it brings about, so it came from the white paper. One of the ideas in the white paper was that it was about moving to a more outcome-based data and not just sort of looking at the black and white of what's your pass rate, what's your withdrawal rate, and actually looking at learners coming into apprenticeships, where are they going after that? What's the point of being an apprenticeship if it doesn't really improve your job skills, if it doesn't improve your employment prospects? So it's there's a lot more, and standards have been doing that since they've been introduced anyway, but there's a lot more looking at the future and seeing what the outcomes are of apprenticeships. And at the moment as well, the way funding is driven, so much of it now comes through the employer. Employers either pay the levy, in which case they pay the majority of the apprenticeship, or even if they're non-levy, they pay 5% of the contribution costs. So with that funding coming through employers, there's a bit more accountability on employers as well, which is good because training providers have been asking for that for a while. And outside of apprenticeships as well, this framework is mostly focused, it is for apprenticeships, but even outside of that, the local skills improvement plans, things like that, where employers are expected to drive the market a little bit more. Employers are telling providers what they want to see in terms of qualifications to help actually get people into jobs and help move them on. So this framework sort of brings that back into sort of the sense of making sure employers and training providers are working together nicely, basically.
So when this is provided, is it sent out to employers as well as training providers, or is it mainly training providers who are then sort of expected to then pass it on to their employers?
It's still aimed at training providers, but it's part of pushing training providers to have a better relationship with their employers. When you're coming into, you're taking on an apprentice at an employer, that you're going through these sorts of things, like you're taking on the right people, making sure that the learner is the right person for that particular apprenticeship. Because obviously, if you're just going to force anybody into an apprenticeship, which often happens in the old days, they would withdraw after 3 or 4 months because it wasn't the right course for them, which then affects their stats, which are then obviously observed by the ESFA. So good providers will have good relationships with employers to make sure the right people are doing the right things and making sure that employers are actually engaged with it as well. Another big thing, with a big reform and the introduction of standards, was actually making sure employers take an interest in the apprenticeships and that they're proactive, they're taking part in the reviews, that they're signing off things like skill scans and making sure the learner's progressing. So yeah, this is aimed at training providers, but it will definitely have an impact on employers. But we can see sort of some of the key sort of things that we're looking at, the data-driven side. They're actually getting really good, the ESFA, at publishing data. Like many people will be subscribed to the ESFA alerts, and I seem to get them like every couple of hours now, I think, at the moment. But ones that I see quite common at the moment are the data ones, updating the QAR data, so that's qualification achievement rates, and provider level data is getting published on a very regular basis. There's a whole new site where you can go on and actually play around with some of the data. There's loads. They update all the underlying files there. So down at provider level, down at learner level, all across regions across the country. Yeah, they're getting really hard on data, which is good. At Bud, we've got a good reporting suite which helps people manage their data internally. And training providers are now expected to know their own data and not just rely on the SFA reports as well. One of the other things that I want to look at, so in terms of the quality supplements, Ofsted is really important here. Sometimes there's not always been a great link between what Ofsted do and what the SFA do, but now they're looking to tighten that a little bit more, making sure that the Ofsted reports feed back to the ESFA and allows them to make interventions where necessary. So you get a poor Ofsted report, it can put a stop on you actually putting any more apprentices on the system, and it could lead to an ESFA audit, and it could lead just to the ESFA at least asking questions, why have you had such a bad report, or and so the linking up of those two organisations is really key, because Ofsted obviously play a huge role in the quality of provision. The ESFA traditionally have been a little bit more looking at the compliance of provision. One of the other sort of big factors then, so I was talking about data, the achievement rates and retention rates and withdrawal rates. Typically in the past for providers, at provider level, you just get a simple sort of achievement rate. So provider A could have 80% achievement, provider B could have 60% achievement. So on the face of it, provider A looks significantly better than provider B. But there could be mitigating factors in that. Provider B might work in a sector that traditionally has a high turnover of staff. So you think of something like retail or care, turnover of staff there is much higher than it is in something like IT. So now with this new framework, they're actually talking about looking at, just say it here, including compared to other providers delivering similar standards or in similar sectors. So it's not fair to judge provider working in a really stable sector compared to a provider working in a really unstable sector. And actually it's saying, okay, two retail providers, how are they comparing against each other, and benchmarking in that way. So it's not as black and white as just pass or fail, A 80% and B 60%. It's actually looking at the nuance a little bit more, which is a really sensible approach, I think.
Yeah, was it traditionally they were literally just looking at pass rates and achievement rates, not comparing it. So now they've got a bit more sort of data sense, and they're starting to then apply that data to the context that those providers are delivering their training in.
Yeah, exactly that. I mean, they did look at things like levels. You would often get the achievement rates down by level, because obviously, you know, a level 2 versus a level 7 apprenticeship, completely different expectations and standards, you know, much harder. So you're more likely to see passes at level 2 than you would be higher up. So yeah, they are just sort of digging down into that detail a little bit more and asking what factors could affect an achievement rate, and not just making it as bad as your flat out achievement rate says this. This has obviously been really important now in COVID, probably more than ever as well. Certain sectors have been hit harder than others. Certain just apprenticeship standards have just, you know, I've seen huge numbers of withdrawal rates. So yeah, it makes a little bit more sense to actually compare providers operating in the same area, and then even region by region that could have an impact. I don't know; it's not explicitly clear in this framework at the moment, but maybe looking at it region by region could help as well, because that certainly has an impact. Two other really good things on here as well: the apprenticeship service. So this is where training providers and employers link up. They agree which apprentices are going to go onto the system, and they agree a price and everything on there. They're actually going to use that system now to have employer ratings and apprentice ratings of training providers. So rather than it just being data as well, employers and apprentices can actually rate their experience with their training providers. So part of a new requirement on the apprenticeship service is that every learner has a unique email address, and I think that's aimed at contacting learners during their course or after their course to get their feedback on providers. Providers tend to have, you know, should have been collecting this anyway. It's always good, especially if you're sort of your self-assessment reports and things, actually getting good quantitative feedback. But the ESFA are looking to include that now in any sort of benchmarking of providers. So that seems like a sensible approach too.
So it's now like an official ESFA source that you can get those employer and provider ratings. It kind of feels like they're moving into the modern world, sort of taking on the Amazon reviews type
Yeah, exactly.
mentality.
Yeah, I think, you know, the apprenticeship service has been a good move, because now, you know, you can advertise for apprentice slots on there. You can, if you're an employer looking for a training provider, you know, you might not know anybody, you're just wanting to put on a few new of your employees, you can actually go around and look at the list of training providers in your area, and you can sort of see that rating of them. So yeah, it's like, oh, like I say, buying on Amazon, I can see this one's got 4 stars or this one's got 2 stars. You can actually go back and read some of the comments, and you can see some of the reasons why, you know, the ratings are like that. So gives employers a little bit more of an informed decision about the training providers they use, which, circling back, just sort of comes back to the idea of employers having a little bit more control about apprenticeship and the direction of travel. But yeah,
is that data populating relatively quickly because it's now a requirement, or is it still quite young and maybe not entirely reliable, like a new product that comes onto Amazon and only has like 4 reviews?
I think there'll be an element of that for a little while. I think they have had ratings for a little while. One of the unfortunate things in my role now is I don't have access to the apprenticeship service anymore, so I can't always see what's going on in there from a training provider's perspective. But from reading up on what I can tell, you know, ratings have been there a little bit, but I think it's going to take some time for it to build up. You know, naturally, the more people using the apprenticeship service, the more that's going to go up. It was only in April last year that the old ESFA apprenticeship contracts finally went out as circulation, and all new apprentices now go through the apprenticeship service. So we've only really had, you know, the last sort of not even a year of apprentices going through there. So it'll take a little time to build up.
Thanks, man.
And you know, I just think in terms of this is actually good because they're listening to training providers. Training providers for a long time as well said, you know, other outcomes, other reasons explain the outcomes. So often, if a learner withdraws, it can be because the employer maybe has sacked the learner's been made redundant, maybe the employer's not giving them the right amount of time to actually complete their apprenticeship, so the learner feels a bit overwhelmed and they want to withdraw. So often, the reasons that learners withdraw from a course are nothing to do with the training provider. They could, and I'm not just putting the blame on the employers, by the way, either, but you know, it can have other reasons. And actually, if you just look at cold data and say, well, 50% of your learners have withdrawn, particularly during COVID as well, you know, that could be something that's completely beyond your control. You can do your absolute best to keep them on board. You know, if learners are made redundant as a training provider, you do have the chance to keep working with them for so long, and hopefully see them through to the end of their course, and or help them find another job. but sometimes you're powerless to that. And sort of being held by this cold data is not exactly the nicest way to be judged as a provider, because sometimes it's just not your fault.
And how are they combating that? They're giving like a reason for those breaks in learning, reasons for people leaving. Are they pointing the finger at a point? Does it filter down into this data or employer ratings?
I think there's a little bit still to be seen on this, whether, so when they're talking about, comparing to other providers and sort of looking at outcomes a little bit more, hopefully that will feed into this. When you sort of return a withdrawal on the ILR, there's always a withdrawal reason. So, but these are sort of these are mandated reasons by the SFA, and you just choose one of them. So it's not like you can put your own data in there. So sometimes it's not very comprehensive, but learner leaving job and learner being made redundant are reasons that do exist in there. So hopefully, yeah, they collect that data anyway. Why not use it to say, okay, yeah, you've had a high percentage of withdrawals, but we can see from that half of those have been redundancies, so we're not going to count that against you. Yeah, I hopefully we will see more outcome based and actually digging into the data of why somebody's leaving and not just saying they've left.
Brilliant. Seems like it's all getting better.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, people are afraid, and you say, "Oh God, there's a new accountability framework out there. What does that mean for us? It's going to be painful." But I actually think there's some real benefits here to training providers. If people can understand their data a little bit more, can understand the pain that they're going through a little bit more, then I don't see that as a bad thing at all. It's more transparency as well. The data that talks about, the emails firing around with statistics being updated, it gives us a little bit more of an opportunity to go and look at other providers, see what their rates are looking like, and it's just more transparency. There's nobody hiding anymore. And if employers and learners are looking to choose the best providers for them, they've got more data at their disposal to help them do that.
Brilliant.
I'm not sure what else there is to talk about this too much.
It feels like pretty comprehensive. I mean, that sort of accountability framework for how that data feeds into the ESFA is obviously vital.
Yeah.
I mean, the other things that it does talk about, like it's saying about learner characteristics and like intervention and complaints. I mean, are those things that have changed, or are they relatively straightforward and training providers should know?
I think it's more just documenting the obvious the practices that have probably already been in there for a few years, but actually just documenting that and using that in a more effective way. So I don't think it's new. The intervention aspect of it is actually giving the SFA a little bit more power to go back and to intervene in providers where they feel they need to. We've seen a few stories, if you follow the sort of FE news over the last couple of years, you do see providers that have ended up being shut down or something for some reason. Having that ESFA, if they're able to see data in a bit more live context as well, not having to wait to the end of the year for it to be published, if it's going to be published several times throughout the year, just gives them that little bit more of an opportunity to go back and judge providers that need judging a little bit more harshly. And using things like Ofsted reports, as I said earlier, to help inform that decision as well. So Ofsted's not new; it's been around forever. But actually, linking that up with the SFA is just a firming up of that process.
They're kind of like the two biggest things on sort of both sides of, you got your compliance side of things for the ESFA, and then you've got your Ofsted, which is like your learning and delivery. It obviously makes a lot of sense to me. I haven't been in the industry that long, but they should be really, really aligned because they must be looking at very similar metrics.
Absolutely. So, I mean, Ofsted, when the RO Act came about, the Register of Apprenticeship Training Providers, Ofsted conducted visits on new providers on the system. So they actually managed to look at the data and say, okay, you're new to the system. We're going to come out and visit you in the first 2 years for a monitoring visit. If that monitoring visit doesn't have positive outcomes, as I said, you could be stopped from putting on new starts, and that would trigger another Ofsted visit to happen again within the next 12 months, I think it was. So yeah, it's just linking up those two systems a little bit better and saying, well, how can Ofsted help inform the SFA who to manage and who to look out for? But it also works the other way. Positive Ofsteds mean that you got positive outcomes on the SFA, which is really good.
Get some good learner employer ratings as well, training provider ratings.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, if you're a
Get some
training provider,
stars.
if you're doing all the right things, then you've got nothing to worry about this. In fact, I remember during COVID, there were some newer training providers who were desperate for an Ofsted visit, which sort of sounds silly, really, because most people are never desperate for Ofsted. It's more that dreaded phone call that happens. But because they knew they were doing such a good job, and not having a positive Ofsted grade was impacting on their ability to get other contracts, they were actually desperate for somebody to come out and grade them. And if you're a training provider, what's happening on the apprenticeship service in terms of, employer and learner ratings, that shouldn't scare you. It should be really good. So yeah, I don't think you need to look at this as being a scary thing. There's lots of positives.
It does. I mean, like from a data head perspective, it seems like they are definitely moving forward. And actually, when we first sort of saw this, we're like, well, training providers are going to be worried about this. But actually, they, like you say, they've listened to the training providers. I take it, listened to employers as well a little bit, and just listen to how the users, rather than doing the standard sort of big governing government body of computer says no, computer says you're underperforming, now you're out. And it does. I mean, like the whole sort of refresh of and we'll get the official way to pronounce it as well from you in a little bit. ROTAP, ROATP.
I've heard
The
them
Register of Apprenticeship Training Providers. It feels like they are just trying to make a better, cleaner universe of better performing and training providers that will actually teach learners what they need to know in a much better way.
Yeah, I think so. You can't really argue with having higher quality standards. It helps everybody ultimately.
Well,
it depends what you're up to, but no,
it
it
depends what
definitely
they're
helps.
measuring it on, and it feels like they're measuring it on the right things, right?
Exactly. I've said it before, but just that cold data of, oh God, you've got a 60% achievement rate, that looks terrible. But actually taking into account the mitigating factors has a big impact. It's something that providers have wanted to express for quite a long time. And yeah, if they're actually taking that into consideration, it seems like a really positive mood to me.
And if they say they do, they have all those mitigating factors, and they're like, okay, we'll let you off. What does that mean? Does it mean they don't claim back as much of the finance that they would be gifted, or do they get a better employer rating? Do they get better ESFA guidance? What happens?
Yeah, I'm not too sure on that. It's something that they've not really, gone into detail in this particular guidance. And there is, yeah, exactly. There's something here which says about the technical specifications will be published in autumn 2021, and I don't think that came out. So typically we're waiting for them to actually give us a little bit more detail on how they're going to take all this into consideration. It makes sense that if your apprenticeship service is giving you good ratings for your employers and your apprentices, hopefully there's going to be some sort of measure to say, okay, well, that's going to help bring up what low achievement rates, and the fact that we're taking in board you're working in a really difficult sector right now, we're going to bring that up a little bit. So maybe there's going to have some clever calculation that brings all this stuff together and lifts up your overall score or something. I don't know, but yeah, I mean, even if it's just a case of it, it's not data driven, it's more like, let's just look at a training provider and say, okay, the data says this, but the ratings say this, and the mitigating circumstances say this. Just allows somebody to make a bit more of an informed decision about, do we need to intervene or not? Do we need to punish or not?
And from my perspective, it probably would be they haven't worked that bit out yet. They've said, right, this is how we're going to measure it. What are we going to do with those measurements? Not sure. What about from your perspective as an ESFA expert? What would you say that they're doing at the moment behind the scenes? Are they working to try and figure this out, or are they going to see what happens when the data comes through and then sort of decide?
It might be that they're just taking this first year, considering it's only just been introduced in August, and just sort of letting it run for a few months and see how it goes. Sometimes
it's a step in the right direction, right?
Yeah, of course it is. Sometimes
Brilliant.
they've got the idea out there and just sort of having to iron out the details, which sometimes takes years. I might be completely wrong. I might have published it in autumn last year, and I'm doing them a huge disservice, and I've just not managed to find it. But yeah, it's not unexpected with the SFA. When they say a deadline, always add a few months on.
Fantastic. Right, thank you very much, Matt. And we'll also provide any sort of useful links in the chat as well, or
Yeah, sure, absolutely.
But yeah, thanks a lot. And cut.